give a broad overview of what we're going to discuss. There are two main areas. The first of which is the practicalities of setting up online. And the second is more the sort of psychodynamic impact of working online that might impact the transference, countertransference, the attunement, and the possibilities of doing deep analytic work through this medium. So first of all, we'll start with the practicalities. Probably people are already starting to set up, but any pointers?
The first thing I would say is it's probably a good idea to keep things simple. So if you have mid-range laptop, doesn't need to be a particularly powerful laptop, a stand, and that can be a sophisticated prefab stand or just two shoe boxes. The important thing, what really makes a much difference, is that you need to set the camera at eye level. If you have the laptop on the desk, it looks like you're looking down at them. And they're seeing too much of your chin and probably right up into your nostrils, which is not a very flattering or comfortable sight for yourself, but also for your client. Because another thing, a bit of a luxury, but very useful, is if you could get hold of an external camera. The external camera generally provides a far better image and will mostly incorporate an additional microphone that's generally of better quality than the one in a laptop. So that really does go a long way to improve the experience. Besides the computer hardware, I think the most important other thing is light. And that can be something as simple as a window or an artificial light. And again, a bit of attention there for those of you in particular wearing specs. If you have a bright light shining straight into your face, you'll have quite annoying reflections. So just see what the image says. And I think the image needs to say that the therapist has invested some time and some thinking into more of a presence. The simple things that make a difference. If I were wearing a blue shirt, I would very much blend into the background, much less of a presence. If my voice keeps breaking up, that will hugely complicate the communication, what happens online. That's the basic element from the therapist side. From the client side, I think in the same way we need to educate our patients, our clients, into how to be a therapist, whether it is using the couch or using a chair. We need to let our patients know what we need. It's the little things like providing some instruction before the first meeting, some guidance. If you're using a particular software, what the bandwidth requirement for that software might be. All of this is very freely available online. And then a couple of very simple indicators: that they need to be in a sufficiently well-lit room, that there is sufficient privacy, particularly in this time where we're dealing with the COVID pandemic. Privacy comes at a premium if you're at home and there's not much space. So some thought needs to go into that. And then the positioning of the laptop. It is probably not going to be conducive to any thinking if the laptop is on the person's lap, and every time they move, your screen moves, and that's hugely distracting, eventually annoying. So I might tell a patient, if you don't mind, could you please move slightly? There's a bright light behind you, or there's a window behind you, and all I'm seeing is a silhouette. Now, of course, we could decide not to intervene at that level. We could decide to think about what the image the patient provides for us says. But I think some preliminary indicators, some initial indicators for the client are hugely helpful.
That's interesting. So in some ways, it's important to be quite instructive to your clients, which is something that you might not do in a normal therapy session. I mean, you wouldn't tell them where to sit and how to sit and where to put the laptop. But so that changes the frame a little bit. If you say you need to put your laptop down, or you need to.
I suppose my position is that analysts, therapists have also always had a relationship that needed to be managed with regards to the technology in the room. And of course, the technology, the digital technology has a particular quality of its own, But it's also true that we do use technology. So at least in my view, a chair is a more technologically advanced piece of equipment than a cushion, or a couch is a more sophisticated piece of equipment. And often in the analytic, in the first initial meetings, there is conversation about whether it's the couch or the chair. That type of conversation needs to be had. And even if we don't necessarily instruct our patients to sit on a chair, the fact that we put a chair is in some way an instruction. So we set up a frame and then we manage that. I think in the online space, particularly because there's such a lack of culture or understanding, and there isn't in the media many scenes of therapists interacting with their patients online. So people really don't know what to expect, and often their experience of any type of work online is rather informal, work-based. There's not much thinking about the frame. If you're talking to your mum, you don't really mind if you're talking to her off a mobile phone using WhatsApp. But that type of conversation isn't probably as conducive to in-depth work as, well, certainly not conducive to any level of in-depth work happening online.
Usually when you're working clinically, you're inviting somebody into your space, or a space that you've rented, that you've set up in your way. So in many ways you're controlling the environment, and you're inviting the client into that environment. And in this case, that's not possible. So one has to be very flexible. And I'm thinking what you said about maybe if you live in a flat and you've got your children at home, or you're in a shared space as a student, you might not have that privacy. It makes it quite complicated to really settle in and be comfortable for your session.
I think it does, but I think it's also true that that's the type of conversation. I think we need to have that awareness that the frame has changed, and that there are factors that need to be really thought about. So one of them, of course, is privacy. And that is a particularly pressing situation with people having to isolate or with social distancing policies, and families being in each other's space. I think we need to be flexible, but we also need to be very thoughtful. It might be that it is not possible to conduct in-depth therapy, and we need to, at least for the time being, until the person negotiates some space for themselves. Coming back to whether we invite patients into our space or not, well, I think it's not as simple as us not inviting patients into our space. I think the reality is, if I were working in this space, they would be joining me in the blue room, and I might be joining them in their living area or in their office. Part of what has been called the sort of collective hallucination that happens online. They will tell, oh, we're not in the blue room today. And of course, they're not in the blue room. They might be hundreds of miles away from me. But their perception is that they've joined me in my room, and to some degree, I've joined them in their room. They will tell me, Pierre, when we're together, I can think of these things. Why can't I think of these things when I'm alone? And of course, in a sense, they are not with me. This is a digital presence. It isn't my flesh and blood. But the perception, the way the psyche works, is that there is this perception of presence. We have to be very thoughtful about the space we create. Little things, like just before this conversation, we were talking about, if you're using a computer and you receive emails and notifications, you wouldn't want people knocking on the door of your consulting room. So, make sure you've deactivated notifications on your system. Try to find a space which isn't too cluttered, too confusing for patients. Avoid personal artifacts. We don't routinely have pictures of families and loved ones in our consulting rooms. You want to avoid that. So I think there needs to be quite a lot of thinking, and it doesn't have to be high tech. A simple background, a wall, maybe a bit of an ornament or picture that's relatively neutral.
If we're in this situation where we have to take our clinical work online, we have to think about attunement and transference and countertransference and the meanings behind this in a situation where we have very little choice. And we need to contain particularly high-risk clients in this new frame.
I think we are living through exceptional times. So in my own practice, I would probably, there are patients I would very much decide not to see online, because I think for some, the presence of the person is rather more important than the conversation itself. The presence, the body, even things like the smell within the consulting room can be soothing for some patients. So the familiarity of the space itself. And of course, the digital space can be intruded upon by tech difficulties, broadband issues, etc. Now, having said that, it does not necessarily mean that it inhibits the therapy. It can still offer opportunities for very valuable conversations, because of course there's nothing in our life that isn't disrupted in one way or another. No process, internal and external, that isn't interrupted in one way and one another. And indeed, some would say that the task of therapy analysis is to support the person's capacity for flexibility in dealing with the realities of everyday life. But I think one has to think very carefully about particular patients, particular presentations, and whether they are conducive to online work. I am quite happy to offer an online consultation, maybe two, maybe three, maybe more, before committing to continuing the process. Now, I think the reality is some people take, in some patients with significant psychological difficulties actually find online work rather containing, even soothing, perhaps less provocative. And they settle in nicely, and the work can happen. Others find the quality of absence, there's a degree of absence in online work, deeply disturbing. And I think then there needs to be a process of discernment. What other offer might be? What other way might we proceed? And whether perhaps we shift from, particularly I would think in this time when people's anxieties have been heightened by all sorts of issues, anything from food shortages to anxieties about their health. One needs to be careful that the changing of the frame is going to create disturbance or might create disturbance. I like to think of this as, particularly the transition to online, as any transition happening in the frame. Of course, if you change from one consulting room to another, because needs must, normally we prepare our patients, we think about what this will mean, and for a while we do not have a patient, we have a visitor to our room, to the new premises. They're curious, they're interested, they want to tell you about how difficult or how easy, or whether it's better or worse. All of that helps us understand something about the patient psyche. And equally, the transfer to online will bring up all sorts of feelings. Some are relieved because their avoidance, their impulse to avoid, is seemingly soothed, calmed. In reality, once you engage back into therapeutic discourse, I think the process, we're back in business. But I think we have to be patient and to discuss. I like to say my mantra with online is very much that you lose some and you gain some.
I mean, that's quite encouraging, because I think a lot of clinicians might be very concerned that they're losing more than they're gaining. And at this time when they're trying to hold themselves and their situation and their clients, it might feel very challenging.
I think certainly, I think there's no other way. I think in reality, in the shift, but that's true of every shift in a consulting room, in a consulting space, in the frame, you lose some. You lose some of the familiarity and the safety. In the longer term, I think with online, we have to be careful, because we gain some and we might gain a bit too much for the patient to bear. In fact, it's one thing for a patient to talk about how empty they feel, or how they fill their life with activity or objects. And it's another thing to be invited into their home, or rather to invite yourself into their home and to see the clutter or the sterility they live in. Yeah, it's one thing if a patient presents in the living area and they're showing you, in a way, a degree of comfort with self. And it's another thing if a patient presents with a blank wall, or if they're using some of the software, they can even create an artificial background, a virtual background. So you don't know whether they're at home or in Paris. In itself, it's communication from the psyche. And I think it needs to be understood in that way.
Yeah, I agree. I think what is very interesting is this idea of depersonalization. Well, it can feel very odd to be having this intimate conversation with somebody who's kind of on a screen that you can't sense are with you.
I think it can be odd. I think one of the things that I'm continually amazed at is how the human being adapts to the environment.
Right.
And I think what was very odd when digital banking was first introduced, I suppose people my age and maybe a bit older remember the sense of apprehension around digital banking. And now most of us and many of our patients actually pay their fees on a mobile app. And it's become very second nature. And of course, we missed the visit to the bank and the conversations across the counter. But it's also true that there's a degree of convenience, etc. I think there is a risk of depersonalization. One of the big risks, I think, that we are familiar about, what we haven't really taught much in terms of the consulting room, the online consulting experience, is that the medium itself, webcam or phone, even phone, of course, lends itself to a degree of disinhibition. So you have anything from internet trolling, you have the more sadistic, cruel expression of disinhibition, but you also have some very pro-social behaviors that manifest themselves. Whether it's, even if you think in what's happening with this COVID-19 pandemic, family groups coming together, people reaching out through the online medium to perhaps elderly relatives that they can't visit, or neighbors they can't visit because of social distancing. But I think one of the things we need to keep in mind is that degree of disinhibition doesn't just get hold of the patient.
Right.
I think if it only got hold of the patient, that would be simple. The problem tends to be is that we can risk getting caught up in that disinhibition process. We might forget that we are sitting in the therapist chair. And I think that can be, so I think many of us who have worked online are aware that one can find self perhaps not sufficiently titrating, thinking through, discerning what to say, when to say it, perhaps a bit more had we had the patient in the room. And I think that's hugely important. So things like holding our frame, the way we present ourselves, making sure that we are prepared, making sure that I'm not wearing my tracksuit, my casual wear. I think all of that is hugely important in ensuring that we're keeping our minds set on the task.
So that's that links in with transference and countertransference responses. So I suppose there might be some idea that the transference countertransference might not get going in the same way online that it would do face to face. But actually, what's just come to my mind as you say that is that the countertransference could be very strong, and you could quite easily be drawn out of the frame, if not more so than if you were in the room. So perhaps there's an extra vigilance that's required.
I think as with many of these aspects, I think that is very true to some degree. and not necessarily so in other ways.
Mm.
So I think we are all familiar to the reality that transference, countertransference, our capacity to project is not limited by the physical absence of the patient. In a communication the patient sends to us, even if it's written, if it's an email or a letter, we start to have our capacity for fantasy, for thought, for linking starts to be activated.
Mm.
And by the time the patient walks in, we might have formed an idea about this patient that is quite in contrast with the person we come to meet. Now, that itself adds valuable opportunity for exploration in the psychoanalytic manner. But I think equally, I don't think we should restrict or define transference, countertransference as happening in the presence of another, because we have all sorts of associations that come to mind pre the first encounter with a patient, whether it's online or face-to-face. Cyberspace has been called a more democratic space, perhaps, than other face-to-face spaces. So the idea of the therapist and the patient can, at least in the initial encounter, be far more egalitarian. The patient can press a button and make you disappear. They don't even need to leave your room. They just throw you out. So there's a degree of that happening. But over time, but again, that creates a particular type of transference, a particular type of unconscious or partly conscious belief. But I think over time, once the therapist applies the methodology, the therapeutic methodology, to the conversation and maintains this thinking frame, we get into more familiar territory in terms of transference, countertransference. Of course, you might not have associations to the manner the patient moves their feet, because you probably will not see them. You will not have associations about the patient wanting to run away. But you will have there is a possibility of having associations to the fact that the patient doesn't bother to put a light on in the room and all you see is a silhouette.
But that can tell you so much.
Indeed.
I mean, I think that I'm thinking about primitive anxieties and the holding space, presence and touch, and that we're all going to be in a bit of a paranoid schizoid state at the moment. So there's quite a lot to work with that.
It's interesting. I was having a conversation yesterday with the supervisee. I think some patients will be deeply upset about our absence.
Yeah.
And unable to appreciate that this is an opportunity for an exploration through another, from another angle. I think we have to appreciate their loss. We have to be able to talk to it. We have to be curious about it. I think it will tell us, it will help us have very useful conversations.
Yeah.
If you think in terms of loss, mourning, melancholia, all the type of dynamics this will provoke. Absolutely. But also, we actually want the patient to have some type of internalization of the analyst's, of the therapist's image, the internalization of a significant other, able to think and able to contain. And of course, often the psyche thinks in terms, brings together things in terms of image. And of course, the screen is another type of image. One thing I think that does happen online, in a normal consulting room, you don't have a video camera. You don't have a thing up here looking at you. And of course, the camera becomes, for some, it becomes a very intrusive gaze. It comes to represent a very intrusive gaze. or a very holding gaze.
Ah,
And they will tell you, when you look at me, or this, I can't stand the camera. I don't mind seeing you, but I can't stand the camera. That's again very interesting material for us to think about. I think it is interesting, for example, that occasionally patients will make associations to to hardware. They will speak about, it's like my hard drive can't take more info. So there's a sort of identification with the computer in front of you. Normally, in the consulting room, they might associate that type of thought with a bin that's overflowing, because that's what's available in the immediate environment. I think we need to be able to think about how the patient relates to the technology.
Yeah.
Because they will certainly think about the way we relate to the technology.
And I think it's also just thinking about relating to the technology and the possibility of the intrusive parent becoming very alive in a session. I know that some analysts who work with the couch are offering to use an online face-to-face to greet and end the session, and the opportunity to turn the video off for the middle section of the therapy, or to have the screen sort of behind where the analyst might normally sit, so that you don't have to have a face-to-face. I think it's being sort of creative, because the phone offers a lot as well, because the voice can tell us so much, but there isn't. I just wonder if, you can hide on the phone more than you can. I mean, the therapist might not think that, because they might feel that actually their reverie can be more free flowing on the phone, because they're less bothered about this interaction face to face. But
I think we're living at the beginning of relatively close to the beginning of the start of this type of technology being applied therapeutically. So I can't claim to be an expert, and quite frankly, I'm not sure anybody can.
Yeah.
So I think there's plenty, every time an opportunity comes up in analytic work, or a new theory comes up, I think it's exciting, because there's the possibility for experimentation and learning. And I think we will see more applications of this technology to therapeutic work in different forms. And I think as long as one is thinking very carefully, considering the impact on the patient, and being open-minded enough to modify their application of the technology if they are no longer convinced that what they're doing works, I think that is a great thing. I mean, interestingly, this idea of turning off the camera during the body of the analysis, some have compared distant online webcam-based therapy, even chat conversations carried out through chat or through the phone, as somewhat more akin to analytic work using the couch, because it is slightly one removed. The literature talks about the disinhibition effect in cyberspace, which is actually what the analyst, that freedom, that space offered by the couch, is something that I think in some way, and I'm not saying it's identical, in some way is mimicked, or a similar process seems to take place. I think it's a time for us to experiment and to learn, and hopefully to learn from one another.
And it could be a time for therapeutic growth for some, to have to survive this transition and to experience the going on being and the continuity that is provided, even when it's not what you want, but it's good enough. I mean, there's lots of potential. So I think that, and then obviously some people will find it really challenging. So But generally, it's once you've got the practicalities sorted and you're having, regular supervision, it feels a little bit like business as usual, but with a lot more information in the room, really.
I think if there's one top tip I would provide, I think it would be keep the technology simple, but make sure you know how it works. And yeah, I've been involved in training up a good number of clinicians in Tavistock Relationships who more or less had never worked online because they're new to this and rather insecure. What they did do is pair up with colleagues and they practiced outside the therapy session. So I think that is hugely helpful because it doesn't help contain your patient. If you're in a face-to-face consultation, you sit on the chair and the thing breaks or the light bulb goes off. So I think really making the time and effort to prepare, making sure you're reasonably familiar with the software. If a patient can't communicate, can't get sound through, what's your contingency plan? So, for example, if I'm working with patients in this country and there's a problem with their sound system, and sometimes it's as simple as their kids had been playing around with their system and somehow deactivated the sound system. So what I will do is I'll have the session as normal using the image via broadband, and then I'll simply tell them, phone me, and we'll just have to call the audio through the phone. I'll put my phone on speakerphone, leave it there on the desk. And the important thing isn't that I'm clever. The important thing is that the patient has a sense that this is a space I have done some thinking about. Some of the software that we do use have other features that allow us to address problems, technological problems, should they arise. Most of the systems, I think the only reason we are able to provide this is because these systems have become increasingly reliable and they don't need huge bandwidths, broadband capacities, so they work well in relatively non-ideal circumstances.
And do you work with Zoom, or which software would you recommend?
I don't want to be advertising software, but I think anything that meets data protection legislation is okay. Some software is better than others in that it's more user-friendly. If you look at the large therapy providers in this country, you'll get an idea of what the better ones are for our line of work. Some require that you store your patient's email and you join the meeting via an email. Others, the joining happens through a link. There are different systems I think you can explore. The large ones are Zoom, VC, and probably Skype for Business. The other thing is, I think when you're looking at software, make sure you can manipulate the image. I think this is the level of detail I think that we need to be thinking about. Some of the software which you probably use in communicating with your families, for example, ends up with you having a large picture of the person you're seeing, and then you have a tiny picture of yourself at the bottom left or right hand corner of the screen. Now, I prefer a system where I can have a large picture of the patient and perhaps a tiny image of myself, which I can place on the very close to my camera, and which I can remove. So I'm actually only looking at my patient. And then if I need to check, if I'm communicating some hand gesture or something to the patient and I need to see myself, I can then switch on that little window. And this makes a difference because otherwise, if you are at the bottom left-hand corner of the screen, you tend to look at yourself to check yourself, and particularly if you can't remove yourself from your computer screen. So instead of looking and listening to the patient, it looks like you're playing around with your keyboard, and that's not a very present image of an analyst attending or a therapist attending to the patient.
I don't know if I'm going down sort of over attunement lines, but I'm wondering if it's important to have the clock near to where your camera is so that you can check the time. Because I know that you would do that in your consulting room. You have your clock behind your client so that you don't have to,
Yeah, I mean, with some of the facilities, some of the software, you actually have a tiny timer to decide. So
Right.
that I can now look at the time without having to look off the screen.
Yeah.
But again, a watch perhaps placed on your keyboard if using a laptop. If I were to show you my setting, which I can't, my laptop is on a stand probably a foot 12 inches off my desk, so that the camera is right at eye level or just above eye level. So when I look at the screen or I look at the camera, I'm looking at you. And I think far too many therapists don't think about these things, and they're continually looking down at their patient. And then I suppose we shouldn't be too surprised that they can't engage, and that the transference gets all confused. If we're not mindful of the fact that we're looking down at them.
When you're on one side of the camera, so for me to be looking at you, I don't know if I look like I'm looking at the camera or looking to one side.
I think it's also true that many of us my age had to learn to live with computer technology. You know, younger people tend to be much more attuned and much more adapted, much better adapted to these realities. And I think in the same way, we know that, for example, phone conversations are slightly different from face-to-face conversations. There is an increased emphasis in attempt to convey meaning in parts of the verbal configurations. I think with the online world, patients learn how to read things slightly differently. So they're not necessarily as disturbed. I think they understand. They come to appreciate that you might not be exactly looking at them, but they still understand you are trying to look at them.
A lot of psychotherapists tend to be older. And so I think that for our community, there's a lot of people getting used to this technology, and it's a big deal at a time where there's a lot going on. So yeah, I think that is quite challenging. Yeah.
I think the good thing is that these technologies are becoming increasingly user-friendly. And if you have a colleague or a family member and you practice a bit, it goes a long way.
Yeah, I think that's a very practical, easy thing to do, to practice with colleagues and friends, and to have your setting and your and to tell each other that felt really like you were looking in completely the wrong direction. And yeah, what a good idea.
I think we also have to appreciate that in these times, it's not just patients that might not have ideal settings. It's also true of therapists, of analysts, of people trying to do their best to offer continuity of care when perhaps there are young kids outside the room, and this is not the time to be calling in people to insulate your office door.
Yeah.
So we have to luckily, I mean, most of this software is actually quite good at filtering out extraneous noise. So it depends how technologically savvy one is. You can set your mic to be a bit more directional. And again, if you're not very techy, hopefully there is somebody that can offer you some support within your household or remotely.
And perhaps headphones could help as well if you wanted to keep the conversation private from other family members, whether you're a therapist or a client.
I personally prefer not to wear headphones because I am very uncomfortable with this sort of call center look. I want to have this freedom that it's the face that people would see otherwise.
Yeah.
Of course, if you're wearing headphones, try to get more discreet ones. But having said that, I think one of the things one has to be trained themselves into is that you don't have patients sitting 6 feet away from you, 2 meters away from you. The microphone is here, so you don't need to shout, and you don't need to be loud at all. And the software will adjust the mic sensitivity to what you can do, so that you're audible. And again, you check with your patients, can you hear me clearly? I tend to rig up my laptop with a little external speaker. In the previous age, where you had a desktop PC, you would often have these large-ish external speakers. Now, whether you have a pair of those stacked in the attic, or you have perhaps a Bluetooth speaker, I think that's probably a good idea, because if the quality of the speaker is better, the volume can be much lower.
Oh, that's interesting.
Because of the tinny quality of laptop speakers, we tend to make them rather loud in order to be able to discern words. So a tiny little external speaker doesn't need to cost much, goes a long way in improving the sound quality, and therefore your ability to listen at a lower volume. So I keep the volume of my speakers relatively low, and then I have to remind myself to keep my voice low.
Yeah, I think you're right, actually. I think there is a real tendency to feel that you need to speak loudly. And also there's this idea that in a state of distress, the middle ear can go a bit offline, and you actually can't discern voices as well as you might normally be able to do.
And again, going back to a bit of practice, call somebody, set up a meeting, whether using Zoom or Skype or whatever, and check that your audio is well enough, because you might decide to wear headphones, thinking they're going to support the process, and actually they might be worse in terms of microphone sensitivity, for example, than your standard laptop.
Okay, well, I think we've come to the end of this chat. Is there anything else that you feel that we've missed that you'd like to add?
I think continuing to support our patients is hugely important in a time of, I would say, national distress, or international distress, should I add.
Global, yeah.
We have to be tolerant of the fact that it's not therapy as usual. It might eventually get back into the therapy as usual mode online, but we've changed the setting. We have to be cognizant of the fact that it will take time for the patient to adapt, for ourselves to adapt, and to learn how to engage with one another. But I think it is possible. I've certainly worked with patients online for a number of years, seen significant development in that process. And the shift from face-to-face to online always takes time. And I think we have to be aware of that, not to expect too much of ourselves or our patients, and then build on little gains we make progressively.
Well, thank you, Pierre, and we may see more of you for some CPD a bit further down the line.
Thank you for the opportunity to share some ideas, and see you soon.